The greatest flaw in the history of architecture is permanence. For thousands of years, humanity has built cities upon one fundamental assumption. A building's foundation must be anchored permanently to the earth. But what happens when borders shift? When cities sink beneath rising seas, when volcanoes erupt, or when war forces entire populations to flee? Suddenly, a permanent building is no longer a sanctuary, it's a tomb. In 1964, a radical group of British architects known as Archigram proposed an extraordinary solution. Instead of designing buildings that stood still, they imagined cities that could walk. Their project, the Walking City, envisioned colossal nomadic megastructures capable of roaming across the globe to escape political borders, environmental disasters, and even nuclear fallout. At the time, the architectural establishment dismissed the idea as little more than science fiction. But 4 decades later, Hayao Miyazaki showed us why we might actually need it. Hi, my name is Benaya, and this is Paralark. Our goal is to redefine how people view fictional spaces through a professional architectural and urban planning perspective. From games, anime, manga, and films to novels and everything in between, we explore how fictional worlds are actually built. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And without any further ado, this is why we need architecture that runs away. Howl's Moving Castle is a 2004 animated film by Studio Ghibli, directed by Hayao Miyazaki and based on the 1986 novel by Diana Wynne Jones. The film received worldwide acclaim and was even nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2006. It tells the story of the legendary wizard Howl and a young woman named Sophie who is cursed into old age by the Witch of the Waste. But beyond its characters, the film is remembered for one extraordinary piece of architecture, Howl's Moving Castle, a gigantic quadrupedal structure that endlessly wanders across the landscape, never remaining in one place for long. At first glance, it feels like pure fantasy. But the idea behind it is much older than the film itself. As I've mentioned before, back in 1964, architect Ron Herron, a member of the experimental architecture group Archigram, proposed a visionary project known as the Walking City. Rather than rebuilding cities after the devastation of World War II and living under the constant threat of nuclear war, Herron imagined enormous mobile megastructures capable of traveling across both land and sea. These moving cities could even connect with one another, forming larger urban networks whenever necessary. Considering that Diana Wynne Jones published Howl's Moving Castle original novel in 1986, I have no doubt that it is somewhat inspired by the concept, whether intentionally or not. Hayao Miyazaki then ultimately captured the very idea Ron Herron had envisioned decades earlier. A world where architecture doesn't stay in one place. A world where buildings move because they have to. But to understand why that idea matters, we first need to look at one of humanity's oldest forms of mobile architecture. The Mongolian gur, more commonly known as the yurt, is one of history's finest examples of nomadic architecture. A home designed not to conquer the landscape, but to move with it. For centuries, Mongolian herders followed seasonal grazing routes across the vast Eurasian steppe, relocating their livestock whenever pasture or water became scarce. Building permanent settlements would have tied them to a single location, gradually exhausting the surrounding grasslands and threatening the very resources they depended on for survival. Instead, the gur was designed to be assembled, dismantled, and transported within just a few hours, allowing entire families to migrate alongside the changing seasons. Rather than resisting nature, this architecture responds to it. It adapts to shifting climates, vegetation, and animal migration, instead of forcing the environment to adapt to human needs. As a result, the gur leaves remarkably little permanent impact on the landscape. There are no foundations to excavate, no roads to construct, no permanent scars once a camp is abandoned. The land is simply allowed to recover before its inhabitants eventually return months or even years later. Long before sustainability became an architectural movement, the Mongolian gur already embodied many of its core principles: lightweight construction, minimal material use, adaptability, and perhaps most importantly, a philosophy that viewed humans not as permanent owners of nature, but as participants within its cycles. This philosophy is precisely what makes Howl's Moving Castle so architecturally fascinating. At first glance, Howl's castle appears to follow the same principles of nomadic architecture. It is never tied to one location, constantly roaming across valleys, mountains, and open plains. But unlike the Mongolian Jir, whose mobility responds to the rhythms of nature, Howl's castle moves for an entirely different reason. It runs away. As one of the kingdom's most powerful and most elusive wizards, Howl is constantly pursued by rival sorcerers and warring kingdoms. For him, permanence isn't a luxury, it's a liability. Every place he settles eventually becomes known, and every known location eventually becomes a target. His castle transforms mobility from an ecological adaptation into a strategy for survival. It isn't escaping nature, it's escaping people. Interestingly, this idea became reality in 2024 when Nihon Sekkei designed and constructed a real version of Howl's Moving Castle as part of the expanded Ghibli Park in Japan. But of course, it's not moving. What makes this interpretation particularly fascinating is that, rather than a towering mechanical fortress, the building takes the form of a modest two-story cottage built as if using traditional Fachwerk construction, a timber-framed architectural style commonly found throughout Europe. But perhaps the most interesting design decision wasn't its exterior, it was its interior. That's because in Howl's Moving Castle, the house itself doesn't have a single permanent facade. Thanks to its magical front door, a simple turn of a color-coded dial changes the doorway's destination, instantly connecting the house to entirely different locations. One moment it opens into Kingsbury, the next into Port Haven, before finally returning to the moving castle itself. Each destination presents a completely different exterior, while the interior remains exactly the same. This creates an unusual architectural challenge. Which version of Howl's castle do you build when every doorway leads to a different facade? Nihon Sekkei's answer was to preserve the interior as faithfully as possible, while adopting the novel's more modest cottage exterior as its permanent physical form. And at the very center of the house sits the hearth, not merely as a source of warmth, but as the heart of the home itself, a role that echoes the traditional European house, where the fireplace was the symbolic and functional center of domestic life. But for fans of the story, the hearth carries an even deeper meaning. It is where Calcifer resides, the fire demon whose magical contract with Howl powers the entire castle. He is its engine, its energy source, and in many ways, its soul. Without Calcifer, the castle cannot move, and without the hearth, the house loses the very thing that keeps it alive. Instead of emphasizing scale, spectacle, or military strength, the design celebrates domesticity. It feels less like a castle and more like a home, a place centered around warmth, shelter, and human connection. And perhaps that's exactly the point, because despite its towering legs and impossible machinery, Howl's Moving Castle was never really about the castle at all. It was about the people inside it, a moving home for those who no longer felt safe staying in one place. This is where Howl's Moving Castle becomes more than fantasy. It becomes an evolution of nomadic architecture itself. The Mongolian Jir demonstrates how architecture can adapt to a changing landscape. Howl's Castle imagines architecture adapting to a changing society. Both reject architecture's oldest assumption that permanence is always desirable, but for completely different reasons. One moves because the grass will eventually disappear, the other moves because danger will eventually arrive. Yet, both reach exactly the same architectural conclusion. Sometimes the safest, the most sustainable, or simply the most practical building isn't the one with the strongest foundations. It's the one that knows when to leave. In that sense, Howl's Moving Castle isn't simply a fantasy machine with legs. It's a modern reinterpretation of one of humanity's oldest architectural ideas, one that asks a surprisingly relevant question. What would nomadic architecture look like in a world where the greatest threat isn't nature, but other people? Hi, thank you for watching Paralark. Feel free to leave a comment suggesting any fictional building, city, or architectural concept from your favorite games, anime, or even movies for us to analyze next. Until then, stay alive and drink coffee.